Hey everybody, we're going to talk about portraits today. I hope you recognize our famous little friend here from Steve McCurry. I think we've talked a bit about her and his story, so we're not going to go into that today. But just a reminder that this is the one for National Geographic, and we've talked about her being claimed as a refugee, and she really wasn't, and all of that fun stuff. Excuse me. But regardless of Steve McCurry's background, he is an amazing portrait photographer, and so I think it's fair to acknowledge him in that respect. Here's another Steve McCurry image. Again, just kind of that one thing when you're photographing small children to think about is getting down on their level. Same thing goes with pets and other animals and things like that. You know, really using that vantage point of getting on the level with your portraits can be really, really dramatic. And I think more humanizing too. So the types of portraits we're going to be working on are environmental, candid, formal, selfies, and then the group and experimental are kind of, maybe give it a shot if you can. Obviously, group portraits right now are going to be a little challenging because you're not supposed to be in any group. So unless your household has lots of people in it, don't seek that out. But anyway, so when we talk about an environmental portrait, a lot of times, there's different schools of thought when it comes to. What is it, Annie? Sorry, my puppy's here. There's different schools of thought when it comes to portraits and whether or not a photographic portrait can really capture who a person is. I think to some degree, we can show a certain amount about a person, but the idea that you can really capture someone's soul in one image, I think, is a little misleading. But you can get a lot from an image. I think the other thing to keep in mind too, especially like when we're talking about the whole Steve McCurry story, is this idea that as a photographer you have a lot of influence about the moment you capture, the lighting, all of these things, and the photographer really does have a lot to say. So whether you're being what's the word I'm looking for? Trying to be authentic is something that I think a lot of photographers strive to do. But sometimes, we still have all our own backgrounds and everything. So keep that in mind. Going back, so this is some work by Deanne Arbus. She's one of actually my favorite portrait photographers, partially because I think she tended to photograph things that in the times that people were just not super interested in. I think I've mentioned the movie about her that's pretty fictional or fictitious, but it's pretty awesome, with Nicole Kidman and Robert Downey Jr., called Fur. And now that you have so much time to be sitting around and doing stuff, I highly recommend it. I actually have the DVD if anybody wants to borrow it. Shoot me a text. Maybe I'll drop it off at your house. And you guys can all take turns. We'll just make sure we disinfect it in between watchings. But let me know about that, and I can do that. But the thing about her work that I love, looking at this particular image, this is boy in Central Park with grenade, and this image is so compelling, and you see this boy, and he looks so awkward and weird. And the interesting thing about Deanne Arbus's work is that if you see this contact sheet, let me see if I can pull it up really quick. I should have had it up here. I'm sorry. Boy in Central Park with grenade. Here it is. Here's the contact sheet. So, if we look at this, and that's a little teeny tiny one. Where's a big one? Is that a good one? Yeah, so let's see. So, if we look at the contact sheet of this little boy, I love that in all of these, he looks pretty normal, right? He's just this little kid playing around, being goofy, but yet that was the image that she chose. And I think that's the really interesting thing about Deanne Arbus, was that she didn't portray people in what they might see as their best light. She was really going for what was the interesting image. Oh, now I think I crashed my computer. Hopefully I didn't. Okay, I think we're good. Are we good? We're good. Cool. All right. So here's some more images from Deanne Artis. Like I said, she lived in New York City. Got her start with her husband actually as a commercial photographer doing advertising, and really kind of started doing her own work in the 60s and 70s before she took her own life. But definitely shot people kind of on the fringes, you know, and especially at this time. So, she would work with circus people. Here's a giant with his parents. She would work with, here's a drag queen getting ready. Here's another circus performer. I love how there's like the little liquor bottle here in the corner. And this feels like a motel room. It's just like, there's just so much, and this would go into that idea of environmental portraiture, what we're picking up from the background, as opposed to just something really simple. But things to think about, here's at that time, children who had Down syndrome or other mental disabilities were often institutionalized. So this was, she went to one of the institutions where a lot of individuals with Down syndrome were. She would photograph nude colonies or naturalist colonies, whatever you want to call them these days. She just really enjoyed doing all sorts of kind of people on the fringes that we weren't used to seeing. Next, I want to talk about Richard Avedon. Now, Richard Avedon, again, was a really well-known commercial photographer. You've probably seen his images of celebrities. Really well-known celebrity photographer that worked for a lot of the big magazines and major campaigns. But he did this project starting in the 70s called The American West. And he shot over, just to give you an idea, I love this, because I think photographing people is, it's definitely one of those more challenging genres. And so he shot for this particular project 17,000 sheets of film. So all of these images were shot 8x10. He used an 8x10 camera and photographed more than 750 people. So you guys can do the math. Out of that 750 subjects, he whittled that down to 124, and these were printed larger than life, so they were gargantuan prints. He did 13 states and 189 towns, all the way from Texas to Idaho. So a really broad undertaking. It's interesting because this project has been seen as very polarizing. And a lot of people feel like it didn't really represent the West accurately. He did focus on kind of, selecting his subjects and really kind of picking the grittier, more interesting people, which doesn't surprise me at all. But he was kind of criticized for that. Here's you see a lot of oil field workers, kind of, folks that really kind of fit that persona of the American West. And I find it interesting, too, being someone who, I know we have a couple of several generation students as well, but, this idea that there is definitely that stereotype of the American West. My family was very much part of that, but there's also a lot of diversity. So, like I said, it was, he got a lot of pushback on this particular project. But I think no matter how you feel about it, the images are really, really compelling and really, really beautiful. I think the people that he picked, and by isolating them on this plain white backdrop, utilizing natural light, the images just really have a feel to them that give you a sense of the person, but not the whole story. And I think that's really beautiful. Here you can see kind of his setup. So we would just tape this white backdrop, the paper backdrop, outside somewhere, and then that's his 8x10 camera, this little guy here. So, well, I shouldn't say little, but quite big. A couple of assistants, because, if you're running around doing all this stuff, that's going to take some time. This is like a 4x5 camera. So if this has two exposures per what we call slide. So you would slide in the the dark slide, and you get 2 shots, and then luckily you've got these 2 guys, so you probably have a whole bunch preloaded. But yeah, not exactly the quickest process. Next photographer I want to show you is Marha Prila and their bedroom portraits. I didn't put a ton of these in there, but I really did want to show you because I just think they're really interesting, and I know a lot of you guys are fascinated by camera obscura, so I thought you'd like these. I can't remember if I've shown them to you before or not, but so these are called bedroom portraits, and basically what she did is created a camera obscura within the individual's bedrooms and then made a portrait of them. Again, just a really, I think, fascinating idea of kind of playing with that idea of environmental portraiture. And there's actually another really great photographer who has been working on a similar project throughout the United States. And her name is totally escaping me right now. It's Barbara something. I'll pull it up at the end. But she's been doing a series called Bedroom Portraits as well. And like I said, just kind of traveling around the United States and photographing people in their bedrooms, not utilizing this camera obscura option, but, really kind of, that intimate space of your bedroom really tells a lot about you. So I think it's a fantastic idea for really kind of exposing more clues about a person than just their actual likeness. Okay, so there's a couple of different framing options that I want you guys to work on as well. We're going to be doing headshots, 3/4, and full body. A lot of times when you're taking a portrait, you want to be really careful of how you're cropping people. So, when you're thinking headshot, it can be up really close or kind of head and shoulders. 3/4 is typically, kind of, so here's a good example of a headshot by Edward Curtis. Again, another, I like showing you guys controversy. Another somewhat controversial photographer because he went around and he photographed a lot of Native Americans, but also often brought, even though, so some of them, like this one I believe she's in her traditional Hopi dress, but he actually would dress some people up as well. So somewhat controversial. One thing I do want to mention, though, that this is a photogravure, and I think I've talked about this process in class, but this is where this image is actually made off of a copper plate in a printing press. So again, the photographic exposure is made onto the emulsion on a copper plate, and then that's put in the acid, and it actually etches the image, and they're just really, really beautiful. If you ever get the chance, I don't know if it was a traveling exhibition or permanent, but it's up at the Space Needle in Seattle, which is probably a bad time to go there now. But they had an entire wall of about 100 of these, and I liked it was at the Chihui. I'm probably saying that wrong too. The glass blowing guy. It was at his museum that is at the Space Needle, and they were just amazing. Like I said, I don't know if they were a traveling show or not, but if you ever get a chance to see that, I would recommend it. Here's another Avedon. Like I said, this is kind of head and shoulders. This one is actually kind of a non-traditional crop. A lot of times you want to do head and shoulders. You don't want to cut people in half. But I think in this image, you really get the emotion in this image of Marilyn Monroe. And the fact that she is cut in half and cropped just kind of adds to that expression on her face. Matthew Brady, we've talked a little bit about him. These are early, these are probably either daguerreotypes or tintypes, but they give you an example of kind of, here's Abraham Lincoln. So kind of an example of getting a lot of images of him. And I actually feel like because it's the same image, that this is probably an ambrotype, which means, there was a negative made onto glass and then printed onto paper, would be my guess. But I could be wrong. It's hard to tell just looking at it. Here's a kind of, I would consider this a full body, even though he's, somewhat hidden in the image. But this is an Arnold Newman portrait of Leonard Bernstein. Really great example of environmental portraiture, obviously putting him in the orchestra rehearsal space since he's a composer, kind of giving us clues to who he is and things like that. The thing I do find interesting about this particular image, though, is that although it is an environmental portrait, we're really limited on what the narrative is. Here's another Arnold Newman image of Max Ernst in his living room. I love the way the smoke obscures his head and how contrasty this particular image is. All right, so working with a subject. A lot of individuals don't like taking portraits because they don't like talking to people, which is fine. So what I would recommend is either try photographing yourself using your camera app. A lot of your cameras will have an app where you can have a remote. Or, find somebody that isn't going to make fun of you. One thing on that note, though, that I find really interesting is, I say find someone you're comfortable with. My family is horrible to photograph because I don't know if it's just because they don't take it seriously or, they're not really willing to invest the time. But make sure that whoever you're chatting with about doing this project with you understands that you need to take about an hour to do this. It's not just a couple of quick snaps. And somebody who's really open to working with you, just because they're family doesn't mean they're going to be good subjects. So keep that in mind. But somebody that you know well and trusts you can be a really great person to work with. Think about having little conversations, but capturing during the pauses. People look kind of funny while they're talking, so you kind of want to have those moments in between. Even if they're doing awful, be reassuring and tell them they're doing great. Don't expect them to know how to pose. A lot of people get there and they'll be like, what do I do? How do I hold my body and things like that? A lot of times what I like to do with individuals who aren't familiar with modeling is give them a situation. So you can set up, oh, here, type on the computer, or I want you playing with your phone, or you're pulling weeds, or, a myriad of other things that you can come up with. Do the dishes, read a book, things like that. People like to have something to do with their hands. So by giving them a job to do, that really can help with a lot of people, even if it's not super realistic. So now I'm going to jump in a little bit to self-portraits. I talked about that. So there's quite a few photographers that have a rich history of doing self-portraits. Vivian Maier is a photographer. She was a nanny out of New York. We've talked a little bit about her too. Hers was the collection that was found post-mortem. And, she never really became famous, but she had tons and tons of self-portraits. A lot of these are reflections and things like that. So definitely, especially given our current circumstances, take some self-portraits and see how they turn out. Reflections are great. Windows are great. I love this one with the mirror, thinking about how you can just find those moments walking around. So take your camera with you and, maybe try doing some reflections, try doing you can use your self-timer, that's a little tougher, but the camera app can work really well too. And play with this idea of multiple portraits within an image. I think that's just a really nice way to do things too. This is her with one of the girls that she was a nanny for. The infinite inception, playing with that and the focal point of where the camera is. And you can see here she's photographing, this is a twin lens reflex. They're a really fun camera to play with. It's a film camera that shoots in this square format. Deanne Arbus used the same kind of camera. Really popular camera in the 50s that wasn't too expensive. But as you can see, lots and lots of selfies. Shadows, other people, just playing with mirrors and all that kind of stuff. Lee Friedlander was another photographer. He was actually a street photographer, but he did tons of selfies too. So, long before the actual Instagram selfie and all that kind of stuff, there was a rich tradition of photographers who liked to take pictures of themselves. So here's one of Lee in front of what looks like the nudie bar. And Lee Friedlander he did all these self-portraits, but he's often obscured in them, and I always found that really fascinating too. So if you want to take selfies, but you don't necessarily want to, be the center of the frame, think about how you can compose your imagery to reveal only parts of yourself. And I do think that like window reflections are a great way to do that. I love this in the frame shop, kind of that idea of the reflection. More mirrors. He's capturing that guy in the background. This one just I always find really creepy. Yeah, I don't know. He just looks like a serial killer in that one. Again, shadows. This makes me miss cigarette machines. They're so cool looking. I kind of feel like I want to buy one. See, I get distracted even when there's nobody around. Francesca Woodman, I think we've mentioned her as well. She was actually, she grew up in Boulder and moved to New York and had a very short career, cut short, because she committed suicide when she was, I want to say, 23. I might be getting that wrong. There was a show up at the Museum of Contemporary Art with her work, but now we can't go to museums anymore either, so we can't see that. But she did a lot of these images in the 60s and 70s. Like I said, a really kind of flash in the pan career because of her short life, but took some really interesting images. And it's funny because, like, I think her work is very relevant now because it feels very timely, even though, she was making these images 30, 40 years ago. Gosh, was it that? Yeah, not long ago. So, but I think they're really, really interesting. Nan Golden is another photographer from that same kind of time period. Nan Golden is interesting because there's several photographers like Nan Golden and Robert Mapplethorpe. I'm forgetting another one. But they were kind of these somewhat New York-based photographers in the 70s and 80s when everything was just going kind of crazy, and they just photographed their friend groups. And Nan Golden also did quite a few self-portraits, but she also did this series of like her friends and her abusive boyfriend and things like that. And so the images are really kind of this interesting, intimate look into somebody's life during this really kind of crazy party time. So we get a lot of really interesting kind of documentation of what New York was like at that time. And just, not all of the images. This one I think is particularly beautiful and really well composed with the reflection and everything, but a lot of them aren't. There's a lot of flash and a lot of them are really harsh, but kind of an interesting idea of just like portraying your day-to-day life, right? Experimental portraits. I'm going to show you some work by Brian Oldham. He's actually a Los Angeles-based photographer. I think he kind of would be considered an Instagram influencer. But he's actually taken that and built a commercial career out of it. But he does all of these really interesting kind of self-portraits. Some are, edited in post-production, but I tried to pick ones that were not so that you can kind of get a feel for just kind of, the idea of creating some surreal portraits. Not everything has to be about telling a story about an actual person. You can be very narrative in some of these too. And there's a lot of genre within the, categories within the portrait genre that people explore. I love this one. Pretty simplistic ideas, but this one I'm guessing did use some post-production. But, he probably photographed the tree and then photographed himself on a stump and then just kind of put that together. Kind of an interesting way to do it. Like, I feel like this is probably, he's on the stump and then he took another picture of a tree and then just added that to the top. That's kind of cool. Fun with flowers. And you can totally tell these were photoshopped because of how they're kind of floating in the air and laying, but it's still kind of interesting, Not perfect, but that's okay. Making some interesting ideas. But this one is really fun. Love this image. It's just the lighting and the mood in it, I think, is really, really compelling as a portrait. Irving Penn is another. We're kind of jumping all over the place, but Irving Penn, I've showed him showed you guys his work for still lifes. He worked for not Vanity Fair, Harper's Bazaar, but also did some really interesting portraiture work. I think we've already seen this one, but kind of playing with vantage point and lighting, making abstracts. Oh, is that it? Is that all I put? I'm sorry, I thought I had more in there. I think he's got some in the group pictures too. Groups, which you should not be doing. Um, Groups are tough. You know, we kind of have these standards of lining everybody up, and so that's a really common way of looking at things. But then there's also really interesting ways to kind of portray groups. I like the limited focus on this one with the Dalai Lama and some of his students. This particular image is, I'm trying to remember the photographer on this one, and I'm not. But I love how it's taken, you know, with 2 sheets of film, and then we kind of only get half of him in this particular image. It's a really interesting way to kind of portray folks. Here's kind of a semi-traditional kind of bachelor photo from a wedding. Band photos, you know me, I love band photos. Here's the Rolling Stones, you know, thinking about that band photo look. Again, here's another composition utilizing kind of the frame. Whenever you see this kind of a border, this is usually either a 4x5 or a large format frame. And what these little notches mean, that's kind of actually how you feel that. So the film actually has these little notches cut out, and that's how you know how to load your film into the finders. So it gives it that kind of really interesting feel. But you can see that, you know, the large format, the kind of the quality of focus that you get is just amazing. I think this is another Irving Penn, kind of reminiscent of the stylizing that Annie Leibovitz has taken more recently, with her very standardized kind of portraits of groups. So just a couple of pointers, you know, when you're working with your subjects, it's great to kind of try and build a little bit of comfort while setting up and fumbling with the camera. Don't tell them when you're going to take a picture. You know, like if you can turn off the little beeps and things like that, that can be really helpful. So they're not waiting. It's you know, it's almost like we use a lot of illusions of guns and whatnot, but that idea of like, you know, the anticipating the trigger. You know, it's good to not have your subject do that. Try and get them talking again, but wait for those pauses. That's where it can be good. Photograph them in their environment where they're comfortable. You know, a lot of times you can see a lot more. Use big windows for light. Think about, you know, what kind of lighting are you using, composition, all those kinds of things, and have them give them a job. And, you know, if they don't want to be them, have them dress up. Let them be somebody else. Everybody loves to play dress up. Well, not everybody, but a lot of people do. Here's some examples of student work. You know, thinking about your lighting, thinking about reflections and self-portraits. Love this one. I love the water's like capturing in his beard. It's really interesting. Getting close, not being too afraid of that. Reflections, thinking about that, telling a story, playing dress up. Yeah. Oh, come on. My computer is stuck. Come on, computer. There we go. Oh, too far. Sorry. Let me go back up. Okay. don't be afraid to tell a story that might be really interesting. This is John. He's a student from last semester. Um, Former military, but I love that he put on a dress to go with the chair, he said. And he wanted to kind of he actually had that USA hat before he said the whole Trump thing. But I love this image because there's so much great duality going in there. And this is a self-portrait that he made. Another self-portrait in New York City. Utilizing that beautiful afternoon glow. Having fun being a character. And then this one playing with, this was, while the lights were still up, so playing with a little bit of the bokeh. And things like that, and then some camera spin, so, have some fun with it. Thinking about your vantage point from above. I love how there's like the snow here and the coffee. Self-portrait action. And definitely think about your focus. Like, is your focus in the mirror? Is your focus on you? Where are you doing that? So play with that too. All right, so for next week, 25 minimum contact sheets. Try and get, 2 or 3 different people. If you can, yourself can be included in that. Obviously, if you can't get that, I understand. Just let me know. And try and do headshot, 3/4 and full body. Try and do some on a neutral background, some in the environment, and just kind of play it up a little. So happy shooting, and I look forward to seeing what you get. Where's my little thing?